Hello, Scareworks fans or fans of the Works podcast. Thank you for an amazing year. My team and I had so many accomplishments in 2023, and we'd have never accomplished those without your unwavering support. I've got so many exciting things to share with you guys in 2024, starting with Scareworks is no longer just my portfolio. Since I was a child, I dreamed of having my own production company. Scareworks was really always an aspiration. I want to be part of the new wave of horror. I want to shape the game. I don't just want to play it. That's why I'm so proud to announce that Scareworks is now officially a production company. 2024 will be our first year, and while I have a long way to go, I am so excited to take this first and next crucial step in establishing myself in this industry. My team and I cannot wait to show you what we have been planning. One of the biggest surprises 2023 brought, and one of the most encouraging, was The Works. This podcast started during the writer's strike. It was spurred by the strong reactions and comments I saw online regarding the film industry. I felt people didn't really understand the nature of our work. I set out to make a podcast about the very real, very arduous journey of making it, the harsh realities of the business and the box office, and the daily and often rigorous life of a filmmaker. I am so proud to say that the podcast has only grown in listenership. In our first session, I interviewed two essential members of the Passion Fruit Nick Story film, Alessandro Imperiale and Lorenzo Courtwright. I interviewed independent horror film director and producer Mina Guy. The inventive and occasional ingenious Corey Shimko stopped by to explain the life of an art director on set. The cast and creator of the web series Nights, Gene Sebastian, Jason Enrique, Emma Littag, and Brandon Smith all gave us a sneak peek into their new season and detailed the various behind-the-scenes obstacles involved in making the series. And in one of the most exciting moments of the year and in my career, partnered with my position at the Long Islander newspaper, I was able to interview Vincent Pastore from The Sopranos and comedian Joey Cola, host of In Conversation with The Sopranos. These guys were so generous to sit down and talk with me, and in both their interviews are full of laughs and amusing details from their extensive and illustrious careers. So, The Works is only going to continue, and we're starting you off with a couple great interviews. We have Stephen Risica and Foster Hirsch, and coming up, possibly next month, we have film director Scott Goldberg of his recent fame for The Forest Hills. Please look forward to these interviews coming up. We have more coming throughout the year. So excited for all of these. Please subscribe on Patreon. Only $5 a month gets you the visual component that you get to see my beautiful face and all the others. Every subscription helps support this show, but it also supports all future projects that we're going to be investing in. Our Scareworks Patreon link will be available in the description below. So, like I just alluded to, we're going to have some projects coming up this year. At the moment, there's not a ton that I could reveal for you, but keep checking back. In February, I'm going to have an update for you. In March, I'm going to have updates for you. We're really excited to show you what we've been working on, but we're going to make sure that what we have is great. So we're taking our time with it. But when we're ready, I'm going to be loud, and you're not going to be able to shut me up about it. So look forward to that. Lastly, just before we get into the interview today, I just wanted to talk about Passion Fruit Nick's Story. One of my biggest accomplishments of 2023 was my featurette Passion Fruit Nick's Story. This short was based off the screenplay I wrote, Passion Fruit. Passion Fruit won Best Unproduced Screenplay at Airflix Film Festival on my birthday. From there, it won Best Screenplay at Los Angeles Film Awards, Best Horror Screenplay at New York International Film Awards, Best Writer and Best Unproduced Script at Multi-Dimension Independent Film Festival, and I was a finalist at Cineplay Film Festival. My team and I made Nick's Story in an effort to gain funding for that award-winning screenplay. We were only able to do that because of you. Because of your gratitude, we were able to raise over $4,000 through Indiegogo crowdfunding. Your 50-plus donations brought us to the finish line and led to a warm and packed premiere at the Huntington Cinema Arts Center. Your support made that night possible, not just for me, but for the dedicated, hardworking people who made Nick's story. That includes actors Lorenzo Courtwright, Abby Gumper, Sammy Lenza, Dan Pavasic, Lee Simmons, and my right hand man, of course, Alessandro Imperiale. I'm so grateful to the massive amount of talent we had on that set, their dedication, and again, all of your support. The writer's strike forced us to put Nick's story on YouTube, but you guys came through yet again on that. Passion Fruit Nick's story soared to over 1,000 views in less than a month after its release. Okay. I've been through a lot of accomplishments already, but one thing I definitely want to advertise to you guys, maybe not an accomplishment of my own, but certainly one of the coolest things that I've got to experience in my career, is during our crowdfunding campaign on Indiegogo, a composer reached out to me by the name of Michele Mason. He's actually based in Italy, but him and I had a brilliant time working together. His compositions are beautiful. I really hope you guys, if you haven't yet, go check out the original motion picture soundtrack for Passion Fruit Nick's story. It's available on all streaming platforms. He did an amazing job. His musicians are all incredible. Really encourage you guys to give it a listen. And with all of that being said, we appreciate all your views, likes, comments, shares, subscriptions, and we can't wait to bring you bigger and better projects this year. With all of that being said, it is now time for just a couple quick ads and then the interview. Thank you guys so much. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and join our Patreon. Looking forward to a really good year with you. If you're local to Long Island, New York, and need movie recommendations, subscribe to the Long Islander newspaper, where you can catch my movie reviews and theater write-ups every week. We cover everything from local businesses, food and drinks, town events, and sports. Subscribe at longislandernews.com for only $35 a year. The Works podcast is sponsored by Reset Lift. You know, I love going to the gym, but I need the right clothes to go in. Our friends over at Reset Lift have created the perfect gym attire for you, because their whole goal is to inspire you to be the best version of yourself. Go to resetlift.shop/Scareworks right now to get exclusive offers on t-shirts, tanks, hoodies, shorts, joggers, sweatpants. You name it, they have it. Use discount code SCAREWORKS at checkout to receive 10% off on merchandise. Today on the podcast, film historian Foster Hirsch, author of such titles as Otto Preminger, The Man Who Would Be King, Kurt Weill on Stage from Berlin to Broadway, Detours and Lost Highways, A Map of Neo-Noir, The Hollywood Epic, and The Dark Side of the Screen, Film Noir. He has a fascinating new book out called Hollywood and the Movies of the 50s, The Collapse of the Studio System, The Thrill of Cinerama, and the Invasion of the Ultimate Body Snatcher, Television. I'm so excited to talk to this guy. Please welcome Foster Hirsch.
Thank you.
So Foster, we first met the other night at the premiere that you had for The Creature from the Black Lagoon in 3D.
Yes.
Now, I'm a pretty big film buff, and I didn't even know that that's how that movie was originally released.
You've seen it in a flat version?
I haven't seen it in the flat version.
No. Yes, no, that film was released in 1954 in 3D. And unless you see it in 3D, you really haven't seen the film. It has to be in 3D.
It was a really incredible experience. And it honestly, the 3D looked great. You know, even for its time, it looks really good.
Well, the 3D was great in the 50s. You saw an anaglyphic 3D that's different from a Polaroid 3D. So you saw not the best possible version of 3D. But you were impressed anyway.
Oh, yeah, absolutely I was. Can you talk about, I guess, the struggle 3D had in the 50s and what its inception was like back then?
Yes, I'm a huge fan of 3D, and I was very happy to see we had a sold out house that night at cinema, and young people like yourself came out curious to see this old 3D movie. 3D was an attempt by Hollywood to attract viewers who were tempted to stay home and watch their new TV sets and weren't coming out to the movies in the same numbers as they had been during the war years. So the studios got scared, their profits were plummeting. So they thought, we'll introduce new technologies. And one of them was 3D. It premiered in November 1952, but by the end of 1954, it was pretty much over. It didn't last for a number of reasons. People at the time said the movies that they chose to make in 3D were sort of second and third rate, that they weren't really A-list films. They didn't put their best foot forward. And people complained about having to wear glasses. They didn't want to. And some people said, I got a headache watching 3D. And I didn't like the look of it. It wasn't that popular. And 3D hasn't been popular ever since. It's around digital 3D, but the films that are released in 3D are not released exclusively in 3D. They're mostly flat with a scattered 3D showings,
Yeah.
and the 3D showings have a surcharge. You have to pay more, so people resent the extra money. 3D has never really been popular. Every time it's introduced, it kind of fizzles out. I love it. I think when it's well used as it was, and Creature, could you see how well used 3D was?
Yes.
How effective, and you felt like you
Especially
were
with the
in the
hand,
water.
especially with
The
the
hand,
hand.
the hand, and swimming. You
Yeah.
felt that the bubbles were coming off the screen, and we were all underwater in those scenes.
Yeah.
Really effective, and the film wouldn't have the same visual appeal had it been seen in a 2D version. That film is popular. Dial M for Murder is popular, but those are about the only films from the 50 3D films that were made in the 50s that are still popular and shown in revival houses, like Cinema Arts Center.
These art house cinemas are so few and far between. It's partially what made me the filmmaker and film buff that I am today, is having access to these films.
Really?
Absolutely, because I grew up living near the Cinema Arts Center, and you know, all through my middle school and high school years, I'm seeing foreign films, I'm seeing independent films, films that generally Regal and AMC are just not showing.
You're open to seeing the old films, though. You're interested in seeing them.
Of course, because
And that's wonderful to see young people coming out and seeing classic old movies. You've got Hitchcock right behind you there. So you have good influences. You have good models.
I put him up just for you. I usually have Texas Chainsaw there, but
Okay.
since you were coming on today, I had to put Alfred up.
Okay, good, good.
So
Cinema is a cultural resource for Long Island. It's an amazing resource.
for me, cinema was just the best escape. I never really played video games. And like for me, cinema was, where I needed to escape to when things were confusing or tough or anything like that, or I just needed to understand something. Cinema help me understand life as I perceive it. And I think I credit a lot of older films or independent films more to that than probably your mainstream ones. I've also seen so many foreign films at that cinema that have
Yeah.
also kind of influenced my perception of the world and how we treat it. But going back to your book for a second, because I could talk about Cinema Arts Center all day. Um, I sometimes when I see these books, I get a little nervous because I feel like it's going to read like a textbook. This book does not read like that at all. This is a very entertaining, very engrossing read. It's chock full of just amazing information. And I'm just curious, I guess, what drew you to the 50s? What brought you to this decade?
Okay, that's a good question and a basic question, and the answer is very simple. That was the era in which I grew up. It's my decade. So I was a kid at the beginning of the decade and a teenager by the end of the decade, and I was already a devoted moviegoer. So it was my movie-going baptism, and so I had a very special feeling for the era because I saw a lot of films. Most of the films I write about in the book, I saw when they were first released. So I could bring a perspective of being there. that a younger historian couldn't. And I did try to share my own memories of going to the movies in the 50s, but also people your age and younger generations have this idea that the 50s were the blandest, most conformist, consumer driven, drippiest, least interesting decade in American history. And I wanted to correct that misperception. Not true. It was a very complex era, political divisions almost as raw and intense as the ones we're facing today.
Yeah.
The blacklist, the fear of communism, us versus them, the Cold War escalating. It was a very complex and anxious period. And the idea of this bland 1950s was a cliche that I wanted to topple. And I hope I succeeded in doing that.
Well, you know what's fascinating is, the numbers certainly, if when you're looking at the 40s, you list these stats that I kind of found incredible, which was, you had like 80 million people going to the movies a week.
A week.
And then it's like you go up, in between the war years, between 41 and 45, you have almost 85 million viewers a week, going to these cinemas.
Yes.
Can
An
you
incredible number.
Incredible numbers. I mean,
Incredible.
numbers that are just unheard of today.
Right.
Can you describe, how much different theaters were back then?
Well, your statistics already speak to that issue. Young people have no idea of what going to the movies was like in the 40s and 50s and 60s. Movie palaces, single screen theaters. We didn't have multi screen theaters. We had none of that. You went to you saw a movie at a single screen house with real architectural flavor and pizzazz, Mayan, Egyptian, classical, Art Deco, all kinds of architectural motifs. You saw movies in a fantastically imaginative, fanciful environment. Some of the theaters had 5,000 seats, and they would regularly sell out. Can you believe that? Today, if a theater has 350, that's a huge theater. Thousands of seats. A neighborhood theater, which would be modest in size, would have had maybe 900, 800, and would regularly sell out. Today, with all the multiplexes, sellouts are rare, and there's some theaters in multiplexes, have 40 seats, 50 seats, the smaller houses? Unheard of in the 50s. There wasn't the same competition for people's entertainment time and money. So people went to the movies. It was a regular part of the fabric of American life in a way that it has never been since. So this summer, when movies like Barbie and Oppenheimer drew people back into theaters and not streaming, that was major news.
Yeah.
It was major news that there were movies out there that people actually went to a theater to see. Streaming has been very dangerous for movies, far worse than the threat of television in the period that I'm writing about.
Even touching more on the Oppenheimer kind of phenomena, we've had, several decades now where physical media has also been in decline.
Yes.
Even my day job is no longer selling physical media anymore.
Really?
Yes. And what's crazy to me is that Oppenheimer, however, when it was released on physical media, sold out in a day. In under a week, the whole stock of that had sold out at multiple different stores, at multiple different retailers. And I think that spoke to me pretty strongly that, people will still continue to support films that they genuinely love, whether it be on physical media or going to the theater for it.
But it became newsworthy, Sam, because it was
Yes.
a rare event. It
Yes.
made headlines. The fact that those two films last summer drew in so many viewers, it made headlines because that's not the operating pattern. It doesn't happen.
Do you think, I mean, obviously there's been a trend of declining viewership for several decades now, but do you think that um, those those factors are more economic or more in the audience losing faith in the studio kind of system?
good question, and both, but also the availability of streaming services where people are getting used, especially during the pandemic when we depended on our screens here to see to be connected to the world. It became easier to stay at home and to get the first run movie on TV or a big flat screen TV or on your streaming device. And that's going to be hard to combat. People did get very insular during the pandemic. I think we're still coming out of it. We're all scarred by it. So I think that's serious. But your other point is well taken too. I think people have lost faith in a lot of mainstream films. I think the Marvel phenomenon has run its course.
Mm-hmm.
I think the comic book series, the big blockbuster series, which Martin Scorsese brilliantly said, they're not movies.
Amusement park.
They're amusement park entertainment. They're not movies.
I agree.
They're not movies. They're not in the tradition that we're talking about and that I try to celebrate in my book and screenings. They're not. They're something else. But the public seems to have gotten tired of them and are going to more interesting, riskier films, which is there's some good movies this year, so it's encouraging and people are supporting them.
Well, like you had said, right? You say like in the 50s, America was more kind of politically divided than ever, like, maybe up until now.
Well,
Uh,
now we're really divided
yeah,
in
I
a way
mean,
that's getting more and more serious. But there was that in the 50s too. Nowadays, the term is if you don't agree with me, you're a racist. In the 50s, if you were a bad guy, you were a communist.
communist,
You know,
yeah.
the words have changed, but the psychological mindset, I think, is basically the same.
You
Us
argue,
versus them, it's binary. There's so much
yeah,
tension between you and me if we don't see eye to eye on something.
yeah. I mean, that's the times, right?
It's getting only more intensified, and it will do so during this election year, where the divisions are going to become deeper and deeper, and the two sides angrier and angrier. I think we almost forget that we all live in the same country. We're all Americans.
When you look back at the 50s, you kind of argue that these movies were maybe more complicated than they appear to a younger audience. Um, can you describe, I guess, why you think they were more complicated and why they maybe weren't treating their audience like they were not intelligent?
But I don't think I don't. I hope I don't make that point.
No, no,
But
no,
what I
like they weren't doing that. They were not doing that. They were, I
they,
think now they are. I think
now
now,
they are. Oh,
yeah.
now they are. There's a kind of talking down, or there's a perception that people have no attention span.
Hmm.
And that may be true. There is an attention deficit syndrome at large in the culture because there's so much media.
Mm.
We didn't have iPhones and computers when I was growing up, so our attention span was different. But part of the hidden complexity of 50s movies was the political subtext, because they, there was there was a kind of censorship or restraint, and you couldn't say a lot of things directly, so you would say them indirectly through metaphor and allegory, and it became subtext. Well, a wonderful example of that was a huge hit of the 50s, a Western called High Noon. Do you know that film?
Hmm.
With Gary Cooper?
Yeah.
It's a political allegory about Hollywood, 1952, even though it's set in the West.
Huh.
And that, without knowing the political background, you can see that the film is very well made, but there's another level to it. The
Right.
science fiction films of the period, Invasion of the Body Snatchers,
Yeah.
is a film with a political subtext.
Truly it is. Yeah.
The Thing from Another World, political subtext.
Yeah.
Them. So the fear of communism percolated throughout the period. And in some films, progressive films or films to the left of center, there was an attack against anti-communism. So there are all this political turmoil that couldn't be handled directly because there was a kind of censorship then that there isn't now. But sometimes in art, if you can't say everything directly, you have to find creative strategies around that. I'm not saying censorship is good, but limitation on what you can and cannot say can be creatively inspiring if you know how to get around it.
Oh,
You follow what
absolutely.
I'm saying?
Absolutely, I do.
Yeah.
And I mean, I kind of also think back because I'm a big horror fan, right? And a lot of times I kind of live by the motto that less is more. In some aspects, especially when you're dealing with something like horror, something genre like that. Um, and when you look at older horror films, I find them actually more frightening than current horror films. Current horror films rely a lot on jump scares and editing tactics, while a lot of the older horror films relied on the substance and of the atmosphere created, of the actual the actual feeling, that the characters were experiencing and going through. Um,
They relied on the audience's imagination.
Imagination. Yeah,
Yes, that they didn't show you everything, they suggested. And
yeah,
sometimes the suggestion was scarier than actually seeing the monster or the threat.
that's right.
It lurked in the shadows. And if you tweak the audience's imagination, that could be more frightening than blood and gore,
Of course.
which can get boring
And repetitious.
and repetitious. Yeah.
Um, you know, one, funny enough, one of the studios that you describe having just a really tumultuous time is RKO. RKO, you say from the start, who was that? That was, I have that here. Hold on a second. That was Howard Hughes,
Howard Hughes.
RKO.
Yeah.
Um, can you describe just the mess of a tenure that he had there?
He was probably the worst studio czar in Hollywood history. Uh, he had many emotional and physical and medical issues. He interfered with the making of films. He would stop films and ask them to reshoot and re-edit. He was an interfering mogul. However, even so, there were some very good films made at RKO under his tenure. But under his tenure, RKO ultimately he sold out, but he did so much damage that RKO shuttered. Can you imagine the effect on the industry of one of the major studios shutting down altogether, which it did in 1957? No more RKO. So, because of, in large part, because of Hughes' colossal mismanagement. So the fact that a major studio shut down was a signal that this was the beginning of the end of the studio era.
Now,
And
do
what
you
we live in now is post-studio era. There are no
do you think
studios anymore as in the old days.
do you think RKO was salvageable if Hughes had run it better? Because there was definitely in the tea leaves that the studio was already starting to struggle.
It was struggling a lot, but they made good films. They made more good film noir than any other studio, and he didn't interfere with a lot of those films. Part of him knew, I think, when he saw a really good director or film, he knew to back off. He chose his victims. He chose the vulnerable ones, the way bullies do. I loved RKO film noir. I like to think it could have survived with better management.
Huh.
No other studio collapsed except for Republic.
Yeah, except for
Sort
Republic. Yeah.
of
You
one
know,
step up from
I
Poverty
want to
Road.
I want to ask you about Republic in a second, but I want to go back to one thing with RKO, connecting it to the kind of Red Scare going through the industry at the time. RKO gets bought out at one point, not by communists, but by people with affiliations to the mob and the mafia, correct?
Yes, yes, correct.
Can you explain how that, set the whole industry off?
Well, it was clear that the mob could not run a major studio, and so even Howard Hughes saw that. So he bought back RKO from the mob that he had sold it to. So Hollywood uh, had to get rid of offensive elements. They certainly wanted to weed out communists, and Howard Hughes was a virulent anti-red. He saw red menace everywhere. You practically had to sign a loyalty oath to work at his studio. And he tested people, directors, by giving them a project called I Married a Communist, or sometimes when it was released, The Woman on Pier 13. And it was out and out a screed against the Reds. Watch out, they're coming over to take us over. you know, hysterical anti-communists, and the directors who refused the assignment were consigned to oblivion by Howard Hughes because he thought they were politically suspect. So he was a political tyrant, but he was a genius in money. RKO failed, but he sold out at the end and he made money.
Yeah. Do you think when someone like Hughes blacklists somebody like that because they don't accept his project, did he have the same kind of uh say power that like Louis Mayer had over at MGM?
In essence, yes, the studio system was set up so that the man, and it was always a man, the man at the top had supreme authority over his realm. They were tyrants and dictators of their little kingdoms. They ran the factories. They were factories. They were filmmaking factories. And they were run by these very tough, strong minded men, all of whom, with the possible exception of Hughes, really loved movies.
Mm.
They loved their field. They had a feel for movies. They loved the product they were selling. Nowadays, studios are run by businessmen. It was just about the bottom line. It wasn't that way in the studio era, but they had absolute power. And they knuckled under to the House on Un-American Activities Committee, who was investigating communist infiltration in Hollywood. They knuckled under when they instituted the blacklist, which is scary.
Mm.
Could it happen again? Of course it could. You'd be blacklisted for something else, not being a communist, but for something else.
Sure.
It in a way it's happening now in a different way. The mentality of the blacklist of excluding those with inconvenient or unpopular opinions, isn't that pernicious? It's not an awful way to live.
It sounds just like rewording cancel culture in a lot of ways.
Yes,
If the,
exactly. Exactly.
we've had,
Rewording it, but cancel culture is very much in the same
yeah.
mental syndrome. You cancel that which you do not agree with.
So the other day, I went to go see a movie called American Fiction. Have you seen this yet?
Not yet. It sounds interesting. I have not seen it.
So it's an MGM film. And
But there is no MGM.
yeah, whatever MGM is
Whatever it
now.
is that they're calling MGM.
Yeah. And I'm sitting there, and as I'm reading your book and thinking about that movie, I'm realizing how much Louis Mayer would have hated this film.
Oh, he would have hated it.
Absolutely
Hated
hated
it.
it. Um,
Hated it.
and you know, you describe Mayer as this guy who's just totally opposed to like social message films. And this guy who fundamentally believed in this aesthetic of films from the later 40s that showed this family unit, this kind of normalized family unit. Can you describe the change in the consumption habits and preferences of the audience that Mayer wasn't really able to keep up
That
with?
was the problem. That was the problem. Mayer's idea of movie making, he said it. We make beautiful films about beautiful people. And if that is not your opinion or your aesthetic, you don't belong at Metro-Goldwyn Mayer, my studio. The archetypal MGM film under Louis Mayer's regime was Meet Me in St. Louis. Do you know that? A musical by Vincent Minnelli, 1944, Judy Garland. It's about family values. It's an idealized version of old America that represented Mayer's aesthetic. He he believed in America. He was an immigrant. He was an American citizen, an American patriot. He was very much a right wing Republican. And this, by the way, Hollywood was Republican in the era that I'm talking about. It was run by people whose political views were right of center. So he had a vision of entertainment.
Huh.
There was no mistake that MGM's greatest genre was the musical, because that represented the sort of aesthetic of beauty that Mayer was interested in. Because his taste was not producing profits in the late 40s, the unthinkable happened and he was deposed. And his successor, Dory Sherry, a very different man, was interested in films with social comment,
Yes.
black and white films about political issues.
Who's also
But
an avowed liberal, right? He's a
and he
liberal.
was a
He's an
liberal.
activist. You know,
He was
yeah.
an activist, a liberal, what we would call in today's terms a progressive, political progressive. He was not a communist, but he was what was called an anti-communist liberal. Very different from Mayer's aesthetic. And he began to release films like The Asphalt Jungle, which was MGM and a big hit, about a heist, Blackboard Jungle, about juvenile delinquency in an inner city high school. And Mayer said, I wouldn't walk across the street to see films like that.
I remember that quote. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's,
Yeah, and Mayer would be horrified by a
yeah.
film like American Fiction under the label of my studio. Are you kidding?
Yeah. It's I couldn't get that out of my head. You know, it's now you describe Dori Shari had, you know, these initial breakout films. You know, he did very well when he first got there.
Yes, he did.
He did Battleground and The Next Voice You Hear were both well received for him.
Yes, they were.
And then it started to go downhill after that point. Do you think that was
It went downhill for just about every studio at that time. Profits declined. They were having trouble finding what does the audience want to see. So it was a period of great uncertainty.
because Dori Shari was so different from his predecessor? Do you think that that caused a lot of tension at MGM? Because you know, you have like a couple mixed accounts here. You know, it depends on who you ask. If you look at the
Yes,
musical department, they didn't like him too much.
they couldn't stand him. Sid Charisse has I have a wonderful quote from her. He was the beginning of the end for MGM.
Yeah.
She said he knew nothing about musicals, nothing, and he didn't like them. And so there was a great tension, and the musical department at MGM, which was MGM's most recognized department, was dismantled. The MGM singers and dancers, the contract players, contracts were not renewed, directors left, and the MGM musical department by the end of the 50s pretty much over. And that was in musicals were expensive to make, and Dori Shari didn't want to spend a lot of that kind of money, and he personally didn't care for the form.
Hmm.
He also didn't like ancient world epics, which is a favorite of mine. Nobody else likes them but me. I realize I love them, and he didn't want to make those either. And he hated 3D. He hated CinemaScope. He hated all the new technologies. He wanted small screen, black and white problem pictures with social messages and liberal social messages. And that formula was not going to work for very long. And it didn't. By 1956, he was out. And then MGM went into free fall and was basically over by the early 60s.
You know,
The
when
MGM
when you look at the trends back then, what do you think was the major reason why there was such a decline in cinema attendance after the war? Was it just people were so exhausted from the war that they didn't have the same desire to go out? Or was it this,
well,
you know,
no,
television coming in?
television was a real threat. Remember, when film attendance was so high, people weren't distracted by any other medium except for radio. And clearly, radio and the movies offered different experiences. Television duplicated what you could see in the movies. And it was at home and it was free. And you didn't have to bother going out and paying money. It was an existential threat and it was an artistic threat. So Hollywood in the 50s had to reinvent itself in order to attract an audience. Profits continued to decline, but nonetheless, say for RKO and Republic, the studio survived. They found a way of surviving. It was in the 60s that the old studio system collapsed utterly. So I'm writing now a book about Hollywood in the 60s, which is in effect part two of the book that you've just read.
No, I'm looking forward to that as well.
Good. But the 50s and the 60s are part of a continuum.
Yeah.
And that by the end of the 60s, the old Hollywood is gone.
It's a foreign country.
That long.
Right? It's a foreign country at that point.
That's a foreign country, as I say. It's
Um,
past, exactly.
yeah.
It's the,
Um, so I wanted to go over to Fox for a second. So over at Fox, um, you had what's his name? Daryl Zanuck um setting up shop there. Um, can you can you describe the difference between Cinerama and CinemaScope? And can you explain how Zanuck pitched CinemaScope to the investors for the movie The Robe?
yes, Daryl Zanuck was in the 50s the savior of Hollywood. Fox was the studio that saved Hollywood by introducing a new widescreen technology called CinemaScope. Cinerama was a huge three-panel screen, curved, that covered peripheral vision. It was too large a format to tell narrative stories, to tell stories. It wasn't a narrative medium. And so the initial Cinerama films are all travelogues. They
Huh.
weren't story films. It was too big. It was too expensive. It was too cumbersome. You had to redesign a theater with 3 projection booths in the back of the orchestra. So it was very limited in terms of what it could do. CinemaScope was manageable. It widened the width of the screen. And so you had, for the first time, a wider view. And it required a new way of making movies. It really did impose a new kind of aesthetic. Daryl Zanuck and his associate in the East, who ran the money market, Spiros Skouras, realized that if Fox was going to survive, they would not only have to take over CinemaScope, but sell it to all the other studios. And they would make the profit because they hold the patent. They held the patent. And they convinced Hollywood to adopt CinemaScope. Fox was married to CinemaScope. Every film in the 50s after 1953 was in scope. The other studios used scope intermittently when a project seemed to demand it. But it was a formula that worked. It could be theaters could be you could have CinemaScope in neighborhood theaters without the prohibitive cost and the cumbersomeness of Cinerama. Cinerama, by the way, is gone. It can't be seen in any theater in the world.
I
You
had
have
no
to
idea
take
what
it
it
away.
was until I read about it in your book, honestly.
Really?
I had no idea what it was. I had never heard of the technology before.
You never heard of that term?
No,
This is Cinerama.
no.
Okay. Well, and if you want to find out about it, there's no way
I
because it
know.
doesn't exist.
I
You
mean,
can't see
they
Cinerama.
didn't even really have too many pictures of it. You know,
No,
like when I looked into it, it's like there wasn't even there's not much on it anymore.
no, it's the past. It's a
Yeah.
foreign country, but you can see Cinerama films from a DVD company called Flicker Alley, which gives in a smile box format. They call it. You get the sense of the curvature, and they are available,
Huh.
and they've been beautifully restored. They're worth looking at as a reflection of 1950 sensibility. But you can't see a Cinerama film anywhere. It's gone. CinemaScope was more manageable. It was large, but it wasn't overwhelmingly large, and it was suitable for telling stories, which is Hollywood's bread and butter. So Daryl Zanuck insisting on CinemaScope as the savior of the movie industry turned out to be correct. And The Robe from 1953, that's the film that introduced Cinerama, was the film that literally saved Hollywood. And as I'm doing my screenings from my book in different theaters around the country, I'm happy to say, I have not been able to convince one programmer to show The Robe because it's a Christian epic set in the early Christianity. It's a religious film, and they say, "Oh no, people won't come to see it," and they may be right. And from today's perspective, which shows the difference between then and now, how could you choose as your make or break movie? And it was a make or break movie, a biblical epic about early Christians.
Mm,
That wouldn't play today.
no.
That you would have trouble booking it in any theaters today. But
Yeah.
it played in 1953. It was a box office sensation. But in the 50s, that period, people went to church and synagogues and temples and mosques. It was a more religious oriented culture. And the culture wasn't afraid of going to see movies about early Christians. They welcomed it. It's a very good film on its own terms, and it is the film that saved the industry in 1953. It was a huge box office sensation. People wanted CinemaScope, CinemaScope, CinemaScope. CinemaScope still exists. We call it Panavision.
Huh. Interesting.
Yeah,
Do you
I
think
mean the technology changed a little bit, but the the introduction of widescreen filmmaking in the early 50s is with us still. The screen expanded from the old Academy ratio. It got wider and thinner, but wider. Some people don't like widescreen as a filmmaking choice. I love it. I love 3D. I loved all the new technologies. Is every film right for CinemaScope? No, but a lot of films are, and good directors know how to use the widescreen.
so? You know what it kind of reminds me of is how in the last couple years they've said that IMAX is going to be what saves cinema and what saves theaters. Do you see any echoes of that in that
Yes,
argument?
I do see some argument there. Uh, I liked the Cinerama and CinemaScope proportions better than IMAX, but I think IMAX gives you visual thrills and it can be exciting. And you tell me, do people your age go choose to see a film in IMAX? You have options. You can see a film in regular screens, or you can see it in IMAX and pay more. Do people your age choose the IMAX option or not?
Depends on the movie.
Depends on the movie.
Yeah, it depends on the movie. And I'd say it's also very hard to tell, like people my age, it's definitely not monolithic either. There's people who have really my age that have really no understanding or appreciation for movies, because most of the movies that they've grown up with have been terrible. And then you have people that do understand, um, the value of movies and cinema, but have also been disappointed in the last couple years by what they've been putting out. And then I think you have people that really hang on and try to support what they can. Um, but I think, um, unless there's a lot of hype around the movie, it's hard to get people convinced to go see an IMAX film. Mostly just, I think, out of the economics of it. Um, I
Is there
mean,
resentment about the surcharge?
even not just the surcharge. I mean, now if you go to like AMC, they'll charge you more if you want to sit in the center.
Oh, really? I didn't know that.
Oh yeah, AMC is
Huh.
charging by the seat now. So I think um, unless it's something like Oppenheimer, where everybody and their mother is like, "Oh, you have to see this in the largest format possible," it's very difficult to convince people. Especially too because I think a
Is
lot of people
IMAX is IMAX an endangered form?
I don't think it's endangered. I just think that the audience is tired. I think that when I talk to people today, I don't know if you feel the same way, but I feel like the audiences have been so lied to over and over again by these marketing campaigns, whether you're looking at Marvel or if you're looking at Blumhouse or any of these kind of mass production studios. They tell you this is going to be a great movie and you have to see it in IMAX, and then they go spend 60 or 80 bucks to go see the movie, for two people on a date, and the movie's mediocre at best. And they're like, why did I just spend half my paycheck for this?
And often I have to say, I think IMAX is misused.
Hmm.
Um, I'm not a fan of Christopher Nolan or of Oppenheimer. I think he misused IMAX. He assaults us with a series of close-ups why do you use IMAX and feature close-ups? He's very, very nervous about using long shots. Why not long shots in IMAX? I'm not saying a close-up can't be effective, but not relentlessly and repetitively. I felt so assaulted by all those close-up faces of actors who weren't very good, speaking dialogue that's not very good, and drowned over by the music. I thought it was a misuse of IMAX, actually. The only points in which the IMAX was well used was the experiment
The
scene.
experiments, the
Yeah,
explosions, etc.
that's a beautifully directed portion of the film, but that's all I'll give it. I think Nolan is an enemy of the widescreen, doesn't understand IMAX and widescreen filmmaking, and is focused on a relentless barrage of close-ups. Close-ups should be used sparingly in widescreen. Of course, they're there and important for emphasis and intimacy and identification, of course. But with variety, other kinds of shots. Whenever he has a long shot, he cuts away from it right away.
Mm.
But that he's not my director. But that doesn't matter. That doesn't matter.
So okay, going back to the 50s for a second. So one of the other studio that shut down at the time, aside from RKO, was Republic Pictures. Republic Pictures.
Yes.
Can you describe how I guess the downfall of that studio was different from maybe RKO in a sense?
Well, Republic sold off to television, and it is still in business, not as Republic, but the facilities are still there as a very successful television operation. So it ended as a feature film company, much to the chagrin of its founding president. But it became a successful and ongoing television. Republic was, does the term B film and Poverty Row? Do you know those terms?
Mm-hmm.
Poverty Row Studios were not the major studios. They were fly-by-night independent studios, and they made B, C, D films that were released in neighborhood theaters for a quick playoff. And Republic, that kind of movie making was very threatened by television. You could see a low-budget Western, the equivalent of a low-budget Western on TV. So why go to the movies to pay for it? You could see the equivalent of Republic's comedies, lowbrow comedies, rustic comedies on TV. So television was a mortal threat to a low-flying studio like Republic. It couldn't survive because what it was doing was in effect a television program. So it joined the enemy and became a television facility, and it still is. I don't think people remember the name Republic Pictures. Do you?
I knew when I looked into it, like I knew some of the films that they had done, but like I hadn't really like remembered the name of the studio.
No,
hadn't cemented itself in my head.
Pretty much lost the history. People know MGM still,
yeah,
of course.
Of course.
Yeah.
Even RKO.
Even RKO, right? Even RKO.
You know, I actually knew a lot from RKO. As you went down the list of stuff that they had produced, I was like, oh, I know this one, I know this one, I know this one, you know, and it's, you know, it actually brings me probably to my next question, which is, you know, when you look at some of these films, some of them are still very well known, right? You have like Singing in the Rain in this period. You have Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. You know, you have a lot of these films. Why do you think some of these films have lasted as long as they have, and why do you think others have just totally disappeared?
That's a big question. The simple answer is that the really good films stay around. And you mentioned Singing in the Rain. I've showed it to students, 20-year-olds, 19-year-olds. They enjoy it still. A movie from all those years ago still provides entertainment. It's said to be the best movie musical ever made. That's its reputation. So I think the quality films hold on, but it's also something else. when I ask students about old time stars, some of the names are disappearing into history, and there's no recognition from the kids. People remember Marilyn Monroe, James Dean, that there's something timeless about their iconography or about their legends. People remember them. Why do they last and other stars don't? I once asked a class, have you heard the name Marlene Dietrich? Do you know that name?
I mean, from your book, yes, but outside of that, no.
Not outside. Okay. She was a huge star. There was not a flicker of recognition in a class full of 19, 20, 21-year-olds.
Yeah.
Betty Davis, I think, is still remembered. Joan Crawford is still remembered.
Fred
Katharine
Astaire.
Hepburn, Brent Tracy, Fred Astaire. There are some names. Do some performers or films begin to seem dated or out of touch? I think so, as tastes change. And it's hard to predict. We do not know now what films that we're interested in at the moment will pass the test of time. Come back in 50 years. What films from 2023, 2024 will be remembered 50 years from now? And which ones won't? We can't answer it.
Yeah, of course not.
The test of time is the most rigorous test of all, but I trust it to some extent. The films that have passed the test of time in almost every case are great films.
Yeah.
They say something, or they create an atmosphere or a mood that continues to speak to a contemporary audience. But we have no idea of what will hold up and what won't.
When you
Prediction, by the way, is that Oppenheimer will not hold up.
I see you are definitely not a fan of his.
No, I'm not.
So I'm curious, when you think of the film industry as it is now, how do you feel about the future of the industry?
It's in trouble.
In trouble?
It's in trouble. It's in trouble. When I was writing the book before the pandemic, I thought I could say with some confidence that the 50s were the most turbulent time in the history of Hollywood, of American filmmaking. Probably that can't be said anymore. I think we're in the middle of the most challenging time for any number of reasons. Who knows if there'll even be theaters 10 years from now? There was some talk coming out of the pandemic that the theatrical experience was going to be forgotten.
Yeah.
That everything was going to migrate to streaming and at home. So we're grateful, actually. I'm grateful to Oppenheimer and Barbie. I didn't like them, but I'm grateful to them for bringing people back into the theaters.
Touching on some of the struggles that the industry faced last year, I saw this quote in your book, and if you would humor me for a second, I just want to read it back to you because I thought it was crazy to read this, considering what we just went through in the industry. So if you bear with me for a second. The battle over percentages reached a boiling point with Clark Gable, who, before and after Mayer's departure, lobbied for profit sharing. Who is he? He's a nobody, Nicholas Shank exploded. We took Gable from a nobody. We lavished him with lessons and publicity, and now he's the most desired man in the world. We taught him how to walk. Who taught him, who straightened his teeth and capped them into a smile? We taught this dumb cluck how to depict great emotions, and now he wants a piece of the action? No, never. Actors are waiters, good for delivering the meal. Only a fool would let them in the kitchen. By what right do actors claim to become owners of the property? Did they finance the production? Did they take the risk if there is a loss?
That was that was the feeling of the old time moguls.
Yeah.
They hated agents, and they hated giving actors percentages of the film's profits. In 1950, James Stewart's agent arranged for the actor to receive a percentage of the profits rather than get a straight salary. And one of the films in that contract was called Winchester 73, a Western from 1950, which at the time was a huge hit, which means that James Stewart made an unprecedented amount of money from that film, far more than he ever could have gotten on a studio contract. And that opened the floodgates. And people like the studio heads said, here, agents are coming in demanding extraordinary sums for the services of their actors. That chipped away at the studio system. And so then it became not the contract system, but the big stars negotiated per picture and made money based on taking a chance that if the film was a hit, they shared in the profits, and it could be huge, far more than they get under a contract salary. It was the beginning of the end of the contract system.
So I thought of that quote, and for a minute, I had this thought of, gosh, how much things have changed. And then I thought about it a little bit more, and I thought again, gosh, how much things haven't changed. You had this quote, we want them to go homeless or something before Christmas, and then they'll come begging to us for work. And I guess I just find it interesting how it seems like every 25, 50 years, these cycles kind of repeat. Where you see these real tensions flare up with the studios and the actors and the people making the movies.
Well, we just suffered through an actor strike, right? A prolonged one.
Right.
Over many of the same issues that we're talking about with the old studio moguls, who were very resistant to give actors more than their contractual salaries.
Yeah.
And they felt, people like Mayer and Zanuck felt threatened by the increasing power of the actor to negotiate on a per picture basis. That went to the heart of the old studio system, and it chipped away at it. And of course, it's gone. Yeah. There are no 7-year contracts anymore.
HBO has this thing where it looks like, or at least back a couple years ago, they would try to keep their own actors. They had groups of actors that they liked picking from and using for their miniseries, for their HBO movies, for their original content.
That's modeled on the old contract system.
Modeled on the old system. Do you think that there's any chance of recycling to old ways as the system changes?
Probably not, because once the actors and their agents got a taste of independence and the kind of money that could be made, probably not. But as I was writing the book, I put myself into the position of an actor in the 40s and 50s. Given my own temperament, I would have preferred the protection of a studio and having the security of a 7-year contract rather than going out on my own and negotiating per picture. I would have liked the security of employment and would have probably accepted the lower, less spectacular money scale, because the other is a chance. What if you negotiate a contract percentages on a film that fails? Where's your next job coming from? It was a chance. But the security, and I've talked to people who were under contract to studios, it did afford a sense of security and comfort. They took care of you. Sometimes they chose well. They gave you the parts that you were right for. So I personally would have found the contract system comforting. Somebody with a different temperament, the actors who really wanted to make a killing, we rebelled against that, because the studio system did keep you in certain parameters. It was only you could go only so far.
So a couple more questions for you. So one of the memories that you share in the book is going to see This Is Cinerama in the theater. I think you said you saw like the second showing of it. Amazing memory. I mean, really cool piece of history that you got to experience there. And in This Is Cinerama, the section that's labeled This Is America flies through all these vast vistas of American landscape and shows you all these great images of this country. And it was a global statement in many ways. Um, how the media was received on a global scale. Um, how do you feel
It was an
America?
affirmation of America's new post-war sense of itself. We were world conquerors in that period, in the post-war period. We were the new world power. And that film speaks to American exceptionalism and American superiority. It's a very patriotic movie. And the colors of Cinerama, by the way, were red, white, and blue.
Interesting.
So it's a very, very patriotic, very Republican.
Yeah.
And remember, Republican meant something different
Hmm.
in the 1950s than it does now, just as Democrat, very different now from what it was in the 50s. The political
When
opinions, nations have changed,
when you watch modern cinema, how do you feel America is represented now?
usually in a negative light.
Usually negative.
Yeah. And probably the American exceptionalism that underwrites this is Cinerama would by and large be dismissed as corny
Huh.
or old hat or reactionary, even.
Mm.
Political designations have changed. I mean, the Republicans of the 50s bear very little connection to the Republicans of today, just as the Democrats of the 50s wouldn't recognize the Democratic Party of today.
Mm. Um, when when we're thinking about how the studios were actually set up back then, um, you describe how it's by the coast, right? I mean, on the West Coast, you had the studios themselves, the actual lots where all the creative types were. And then on the East Coast, you had all the money. Um,
And that
how,
created, that was a division of the spoils and it created tension. The moguls on the West Coast had to get along with their opposite numbers on the East Coast because they controlled the money. So Mayer was the emperor of MGM in Culver City, but he had to deal with his opposite number in New York. They didn't get along,
mm,
and that ultimately contributed to
him being
Mayer's downfall.
replaced. Yeah. When you, but like MGM wasn't the only one set up like that too. I mean, Fox is
They
also
all were.
they were all set
They
up
all
like
were.
that. Do you think that was a smart way to go about things, being that the money wasn't really in I mean directly involved with making the pictures?
Well, it was a way of controlling and limiting the power of the moguls in Los Angeles. So they had to be responsible to the East Coast money. It worked. It was a division of the spoils. It worked. It
Hmm.
worked. But you had to be to keep your power. You had to be a good negotiator. You had to be a good people person. You had to understand who your opposite number was. Daryl Zanuck didn't like Spiro Skouras in New York, but he was a shrewd operator. He got along with him. And because they got along, they were able to work together to institute cinema across the industry, CinemaScope across the industry, and they saved Hollywood because they realized they had to work together,
Hmm.
regardless of what their personal opinions were.
Hmm. So my I guess my last question for you is as you go back and watch these movies that you saw as a teenager or you saw just throughout your life, um, you mentioned how they take on different meaning, especially as you get older, or like you perceive them differently. Is there a movie that you kind of rediscovered while writing this book that um, changed your perspective on it?
I mean, did I have a different opinion in the 50s than I had working
Yeah,
on the
yeah,
recently?
yeah.
In most cases, no.
Huh.
Films that I liked in the 50s, I still like. I was worried about what you just said, that films that I remember having loved as a kid, I would see them now as a senior citizen, and I'd have a different attitude. In most cases, I almost appreciated the films more now. I, at the end of my work, I felt confident in saying this was the greatest decade in the history of American filmmaking. I still feel that way. More great films from this 10-year period than any other 10-year period in our history. I have an affinity for the films. My sensibility resonates with the films. I did not have a change of heart about anything. It only confirmed me in my belief that this was the great period of filmmaking. Was every film great? Of course not. There were a lot of terrible movies, terrible. And there are some films that I really dislike, but I think I disliked them when I saw them as a kid.
So yeah.
I remember seeing The African Queen as a kid, and I didn't like either Humphrey Bogart or Katharine Hepburn. I didn't like the characters, and I didn't want to spend time with them. When I saw it again for the book, I liked it even less. I don't like these people. I don't want to spend an hour and a half with them. I think it's a very bad film, badly made, and
Yeah.
predictable.
Yeah.
I couldn't stand The Quiet Man
Okay.
as a kid, and I
Yeah.
couldn't stand it now.
Yeah.
So, and the films that I loved, a film noir with Joan Crawford called Sudden Fear. I saw that in 1952. I was 10. I
Yeah.
loved it. And I saw it again, and I loved it even more. So I don't think I had a change of heart about anything.
Okay. I just because I have you here, I'm kind of just curious. What's your
Well,
thoughts on
show the
Oh, I
Sam.
got you. I got you. I got it right here.
Yeah, okay.
I got it. I'm going to show it off at the end. I promise. While I got you though, I'm going to ask you one last question. Because I'm just curious. In your opinion of the guy, how do you feel about Stanley Kubrick?
Brilliant,
Brilliant. Um,
brilliant. And he came to his maturity in the 50s.
yeah.
If you've seen his first films, they're I don't think they show any talent at all. I think they're terrible.
Okay.
And he wanted to suppress them, by the way.
Yeah.
He really wanted to suppress them. They're terrible. And then the killing happens. You know that film about the racetrack heist?
Yeah.
A great film. So he made bad films, two bad films. People still gave him money. United Artists really helped him. And all of a sudden, out of amateur filmmaking, a masterpiece emerged. And he made The Killing and then Paths of Glory.
That's what I just saw the other day for the
It
first
was
time. They actually
very
showed it.
powerful.
They showed that at Cinema Arts Center. And I saw it for the first time in theaters.
Oh, they
Uh,
showed it recently?
Yeah, and I thought that was really special. And one of the things that I'm watching Paths of Glory, and when I met you, we were watching Creature from the Black Lagoon, and in both these films, I'm noticing these echoes in modern films. In Paths of Glory, I'm sitting there watching it, and I'm like, this is the movie 1917. I mean, there's almost shot for shot remakes of scenes in 1917 that were in Paths of Glory. In Creature from the Black Lagoon, you have the scene where the creature gets caught in the net, and it's almost shot for shot, very similar to Jaws. And seeing how
Yeah.
how these filmmakers are really inspired by all these previous films. Um,
The filmmakers who have an appreciation of the past and who are students of the Hollywood classics tend to make better movies than the arrogant ones who dismiss the past, as you use the term, pernicious cancel culture. I don't have to look at these stupid old movies from the past. I'm making new art.
yeah.
I think in order to know your field, you've got to know the history of your field, whatever field you're in.
Yeah.
So the really good filmmakers are students of the medium in which they've chosen to work.
Yeah.
And they recognize, I think the Spielbergs and the Scorseses, who are real students of Hollywood film history, recognize the masterpieces that precede their time. Scorsese is a wonderful film historian. In addition to being a good filmmaker, he really appreciates the past. And I'm so grateful to him. He appreciates the rogue.
Yeah.
Nobody appreciates that film. He says
Well,
it was a fantastic experience to see that film when it first opened.
it's crazy you bring up Scorsese. Speaking of echoes, the other day, also at the Cinema Arts Center, they were doing a double feature of The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari and Nosferatu. And I don't know if you've ever seen Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, um, but I'm watching it, and me and the other filmmaker I was with came to this epiphany. It's Shutter Island. It's the movie Shutter Island that Martin Scorsese did. And it was kind of incredible to us because Shutter Island, when you think about it as a concept as a story, it's complicated. That's a complicated story to tell. And Caligari did it silently, expertly,
I am
silently.
certain that Scorsese knew Caligari. I know that he
Yeah.
knows it, appreciates it, and studied it, and whether it was a conscious or unconscious influence on Shutter Island. I'm sure you're right in the artistic inspiration for that movie. I'm sure you're right.
It's just really incredible. The more that I delve into the history of cinema, the more I understand modern cinema, in so
Good,
many ways. And
good.
just coming to a conclusion here, I have to say that while I was reading your book, I actually, between the strikes and between this threat of AI coming, I actually had a lot of hope reading your book. Your book actually um kind of gave me a little bit of faith that the industry has adapted and been through lots. There's been lots of change since this industry's inception. And um, I think if we could weather the things that we've weathered in the past, I don't think that we'll fizzle out now.
No,
Um,
and as I say, this past year's been encouraging. There have
yeah,
been a lot of films that are worthwhile, that show talent. Students sometimes say to me, because they know I'm so interested in the past, we know that you love these great films from the past. Do you like any current films? And is there the possibility of making good films now? And the answer is, of course, yes.
yeah.
Yes, I do like current films. Yes, some current films. I do like some current directors. Will good films continue to be made in Hollywood and elsewhere? Of course.
Yeah.
Of course. It may be harder, but it can be done.
Well, on that note, I
On
would
that
like to
note,
On that note, I would like to thank Foster Hirsch for coming on the podcast today. If you're interested in hearing him speak, you can catch him at the British Film Institute on January 24th, or a 3-month Fabulous 50 series in DC starting when?
February 2nd, I'm down there February 2nd, 3rd, and 4th to introduce 8 films from the fabulous 50s.
You heard it
And a
here.
continuing series on the 50s at your alma mater, Cinema Arts Center. I'll be speaking there February, March, April, into May, periodically about the 50s, and I hope you'll come again.
I will definitely be there.
Thanks.
All right. Thank you, Foster, for coming on today. Pleasure speaking
Okay.
with you.
Thank you.